I'm Vince Long, and on behalf of the Dell Home Service League, I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning. We're excited to have our speaker, Steve Compton, join us. Before we get started on that, just a couple of quick announcements. If you're not familiar with the Dell Home, I see we've got a lot of guests today. We are the ceramics affiliate of the Mint Museum, and our mission is to support ceramics in all its forms throughout North Carolina. One of our signature events is Potter's Market at the Mint, which will occur Saturday, September 25th. We're working on the planning for that now. If you'd like to know more about the Dell Home, if you're interested in learning about upcoming programs or joining Dell Home, you can always send us an email at dellhomeserviceleague@gmail.com. And during the session today, I'll put in the chat session, I'll put some links in there with that email address, and also our website where you can go and see more information. We do have a few more programs that we're adding to our schedule. In April, we're working on 2 more studio visits with different potters around the state. I think we've gotten confirmed that in late April, we'll be having a session with Akira Satake in Asheville. And we've got another one, some potters in the Seagrove area that we're working on lining up right now and confirming some dates. So that'll be coming up. And then we've got a special treat. If you got the reminder email about this program over the weekend, on March 23rd, there's a unique program put on by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They've got a new ceramics exhibition starting, Shapes from Out of Nowhere, Ceramics from the Robert A. Ellison Jr. Collection. This is supposed to be a spectacular new exhibit, and they're hosting a sort of a walkthrough tour of the exhibit and some interviews with curators, that type of thing. We provided the link, the information in that email, and we'll send that out again prior to that event. But again, if you're not on our mailing list now and would like to learn more about that, just send us an email and we'll get you added to the list. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janet Nelson, one of our vice presidents for programming, who's going to do the introduction of our speaker. Janet.
Okay, thank you, Vince. We're pleased to have Steve Compton here today. And Steve is a North Carolina native. He's from Alamance County. He's an avid collector of 18th to 20th century North Carolina pottery. Steve has written extensively, and a few of his books include North Carolina Pottery, Earthenware, Stoneware, and Fancyware, Seagrove Pottery, Through Time, A Handed Down Art, The Brown Family, and It's Just Dirt, the historic pottery of North Carolina's Seagrove region. Steve has written several scholarly articles. For the Journal of the American Art Pottery Association, he wrote Jugtown Pottery, an American folk craft with a pedigree. For Ceramics in America, an article entitled In the Pale Moonlight, Jugs and Alcohol in North Carolina. He's widely recognized for his expertise, and he's frequently called upon as a lecturer and exhibit curator. He served as president of the North Carolina Pottery Center in Seagrove and co-founded the North Carolina Pottery Guild. Steve holds degrees from UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University, and Emory University, and he currently lives in Montezuma in the North Carolina mountains. So we're very happy to have you all here today, and I will now turn the program over to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
There we go. Good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning. It's great to be here. I am Steve Compton. I am not a potter. I am a collector of wonderful pottery, and we'll tell you a bit about that today. I've been a collector all my life. I, as a kid, would collect rocks and minerals and arrowheads, and since then, I've collected Biltmore Industries carvings, fretless banjos from the mountains, but never collected anything like I have the pottery. And I will try to tell you that story a bit this morning. I've been collecting for a number of years, and it all began in 1974, which seems like a long time ago, and it was a long time ago, wasn't it? But I was between undergraduate school at Carolina and then 2 stints in graduate school, and during that time was employed as a photographer for a small newspaper in Mebane, North Carolina, right on the boundary between Orange and Alamance counties. Worked with a new writer at the time also, Tom Patterson. You may know Tom, who's gone on to great things in the folk art world. And in 1974, in October, Tom and I were sent to the Seagrove area to do a feature article on North Carolina potters. And I'd grown up in Alamance County and knew nothing about the fact that we had such a great tradition of pottery making in the state. So we visited Teague Pottery and Jugtown Pottery and a few others, but it was Jugtown Pottery that really captured me that day. And you'll see both me and Todd there with a bit more hair than we either have today, I think. And then Vernon Owens to the right in the article, one of the photographs I took of Vernon, who I believe this year will be 80 and is the longest serving master potter at Jugtown Pottery. Well, on that day, learned a lot about pottery from Vernon and Nancy Sweezy, who at the time was the manager there for Country Roads, that as a nonprofit was operating Jugtown for a while. And that day, I bought my first ever piece of pottery. This is a Jugtown vase turned by Vernon in the Country Road style. And though there have been many since then, this remains one of my favorites since it was the first piece. So first piece of quite a few, as you will see. But it took 16 more years for me to begin collecting the pottery. I, as I mentioned, had more educational pursuits ahead of me and family with 2 sons and work. And it took a while, but then I said, you know, I need a hobby. I need to do some more collecting. And I remembered Jugtown. And so I went out, found the next piece of Jugtown pottery. Began to meet people in the antique malls and shops who knew something about pottery. And a good friend, became a good friend who ran one of the antique malls in Central North Carolina, asked me one day, he said, well, Steve, he says, what kind of North Carolina pottery are you going to collect? Of course, in my, I guess, naivete, but also just lack of discernment, I said, all of it. Well, there's a lot of it to collect. And the accumulation began at that point. Now, what I meant by all of it was not all of it, but was all kinds of it, because I really had not decided, and I still haven't. I'm still collecting all kinds of it in that traditional folk vein of pottery. To begin, I needed to learn. I knew nothing, as I mentioned, about it, and began what I call the study collection. It was one way to justify it, I guess. And I began to buy pieces that I liked, pieces I could afford, began picking up books like the ones that you see. And there were a few books around then about North Carolina's traditional pottery, but not too many. And began to just ask questions when I would find a piece that I liked. Well, what is it? Who made it? When was it made and where was it made? And is there some importance in that piece? And so the study collection began, and honestly, very few of the pieces from the original study collection period are in my collection today. I have traded and sold and given away, and that in my way has been the way to build a collection without a lot of money to do it with, just right out of the pocket. Well, I learned things during that study collection period, like how to tell an old from a not so old Jugtown example. And one of the things I learned was if you had an old stamped piece of Jugtown, you could put a quarter over the mark and it wouldn't quite cover the mark. But if it were made after 1960, quarter would cover the mark, except for the fact, as I learned, that in the post 1960 period, infrequently, but at times, the old mark was used as well. So that was somewhat helpful. And people today still ask that question, well, is it larger or smaller than a quarter? And I have to explain, well, it may not matter that much. But I learned things like that. I began to hear people in collections circles and in shops mention people like Potter Bill. Well, do you know about Potter Bill? And I said, no, I don't know about Potter Bill. Who is that? And someone said, well, I think his last name was James. And so one day in Fancy Gap, Virginia, stopped in a little shop and I found this painted but early looking piece of earthenware marked on the bottom, W.F. James, Farmington, NC. I thought, aha, maybe this is Potter Bill. What I went on to learn in the study process, indeed it was. William F. James, known as Potter Bill, and his family and to neighbors in the Farmington area. And I mentioned this to an old collector, old time collector, who'd been collecting for years. And she said, you know, I remember when my husband and I visited one of his family members one time, and I saw a picture of Potter Bill standing beside his kiln. Well, that drove me crazy. It was like collector and researcher together. It was like, where is it? I need to find it. And for years, I sought out information, see if I could learn about this photograph, until one day I visited the Wright family member in Winston-Salem, and he pulled out an album and he said, oh, by the way, here's my grandpa, Potter Bill James, standing beside his kiln. And I was, of course, thrilled when that happened. And there he is. This is probably in the 1920 to 30 period when he really had mostly stopped making pottery. But what was so intriguing about Potter Bill was that at that late date, he was only making lead glazed earthenware. And many people who knew about him believed that he was the last of the Moravian potters from the Winston-Salem, Forsyth County area. Turns out not at all. Apparently had no connection to them. But his father was a potter, as was his brother. His grandfather probably was a potter, and he was among a group of potters, a large group of potters in Yadkin County, just north of Farmington, in the old town location of Huntsville, which started in 1792. It's a fascinating story about his origins and about potters of that area. Again, I'm learning, I'm studying, and I'm benefiting from that. Again, someone said, well, do you have any Maston pottery in your collection? I said, I don't think so. What is it? And as they described it, I said, oh, you mean like the picture that I found years ago in Statesville in a little shop? Glad I didn't sell it. Turned out, indeed, this is a piece made in the 1920s in the almond pottery near Seagrove, decorated in this marbling style by a man named C.B. Maston. So I learned, and today I know what it looks like. And the one on the left in multicolor, I just recently found in a shop in Asheville. And the seller didn't quite know what it was worth, which was great. That's what's fun about this. So mastered and decorated pottery, I learned. Again, I knew what I was looking for. There was a Smithfield art pottery in Johnston County, North Carolina, and Bill Gordy from Georgia worked there, as well as several other potteries in the state in the 20th century. And one of the things that Bill Gordy describes in an interview is how Herman Cole, the owner of the Smithfield Art Pottery Shop, had a room. And in that room were bisque-fired examples of every shape made by the shop. And daily, he would say to the workers, the potters, the turners, I want you to make so many dozen of number so-and-so pot. And they would go in the room and look at it, and they had to make the piece exactly like the one on the shelf. And he said the interesting thing was it would have a stock number on the piece, and it had the pounds of clay that you needed to make it in the greenware, and it told you how high the piece needed to be. And turns out, here's an example of that. Number 74 with 4 pounds of clay and 10 inches high. Well, Smithfield pottery is almost never marked. Paper labels were used on some of the pieces, and they're long gone. I've only seen one stamped piece that says Smithfield pottery, and the discovery that there were numbered examples like this, and I've seen at least 3 of these now. You could put a finished piece of unmarked Smithfield pottery beside it and see how closely the potters were able to replicate the pieces on the shelf. So that was how I began. Study collection, buy what I can afford, trade it off as I decide I like something better or can afford something a little more expensive, and then see what you've learned and how it pays off. So you remember I just mentioned Smithfield art pottery. Well, before it was called Smithfield, it was called Hillside Pottery. A couple of years back or so, on a Facebook group, a member posted a trove of information like this: photographs, some of them hand colored, brochures, all about a hillside pottery located on 5th Avenue in New York City. But the pots all looked North Carolina made. I immediately recognized what it was from what I'd learned and contacted the owner, and we made a deal, and I now possess his collection. Well, I had pieces in my collection unmarked that I didn't know anything about their origin, but look, there's an example that was in my collection, and there's an example in one of the photographs from the Hillside Pottery Shop. So I learned from that and knew exactly what it was. Well, why does it say New York City? That address on 5th Avenue is a distribution center, a market, and wholesalers there sold for Hillside Pottery, Royal Crown Pottery, located at Mary Oaks in Wake County and in Chatham County, and several others. And again, by digging in, learning what I could, I knew things. And when I see things like that, I say, I know what that is. And wonderful. And sometime I'm hoping later this year to be able to put this group of materials from Hillside in some form that can be shared for other collectors. So again, where does the study collection pay off? Traveling through Maine and nearing Freeport to go to the LL Bean location, which to me turned out to be like most any other outlet shopping center. I like shopping now from the catalog better than going there. But I stopped in a little junk shop, and in a glass showcase spotted this piece, and my brain said to my eye, Jugtown. Looks like Jugtown. So I asked that it be taken out of the showcase. And when I did, what I recognized was that it was unmarked. There was no Jugtown mark on it. And then it struck me, I know it's Jugtown related. It's actually J.H. Owen made for Jacques Busby, who was the founder of Jugtown Pottery. And they weren't using the mark from 1917 until about 1921. Now, on this piece was a little sticker, like you make price tags with a little hand machine, and it said $15. And I thought, well, they forgot to take the yard sale tag off of it before they put it in the showcase. So I asked the vendor, I said, well, how much for this piece? And she looked at me kind of strangely. She says, well, it's right there. It's $15. And you know that dish goes with it as well. And you see it sitting on a dish. Well, that's not the way it was sold originally, but it's also a J.H. Owen dish. And she said, now that's included. You know that. And I said, thank you. I will take both. And so again, the knowledge base paid off just by being able to spot something like that. Then at Liberty Antiques Festival some years ago, a friend said, I need you to look at a piece of pottery a vendor has and tell me what you think. And I looked at it and I immediately recognized the shape and the glaze. It was certainly earthenware. That handle was a giveaway. And when I turned it over, I saw these strange marks on the base. Well, I'd just been studying both John Bivens' book and a book by archaeologist Stan South, where I knew, particularly when I saw that strange looking inscribed mark on the base, that this was a Moravian pitcher, most likely made by Rudolph Christ. And the marks were his odd way of pricing all the ware that he was making at the time. The Moravian community's leadership required that the pieces being made be priced so that everyone would be charged the same thing. And I knew that, and immediately I said, how much? And I was able to buy that based on the knowledge. Now, the piece on the right went further and verified it, that is an excavated example from Bethabara, the earliest Moravian community in what's now Forsyth County. And both Chris and Krause, who followed him, made wares, and you see that they're essentially the identical picture. Then in a Winston-Salem shop, I found this piece sitting on the floor in the shop, missing a lid, obviously, and chipped on the spout. But again, I noticed that peculiar handle and also that very unusual spout that looked more like something built on Leeds teapot from England than anything else. But I just had a hunch. So back home I went, pulled out the Moravian book. I did find it in Winston-Salem after all. And lo and behold, in a very tiny picture, John Bivens had included teapot spout molds from the Moravian community. And there it was. And I very carefully matched every one of the little curls and dots to the spout on this teapot. And I knew then that this was a locally made piece. You'll see the actual mold to the right of the spout turn in the way it would have been used to make that side of the spout on it there. The large size of this piece suggests to me that it was meant to be imitation of a punch pot rather than a teapot. It's much larger than the Moravian teapot pieces. Again, knowing what I did and learned in the study time, matching up things like this jar, which matches the top shape of an archaeologically recovered piece, and on its base, the letter K matches what Stan South speculated was an indication that these were apothecary jars made for Hans Kalberlein, who was the first physician to serve in the Moravian community, which would date this then to Gottfried Aust period. Aust was the first potter there in the Moravian community. So from study collection to the hoard, it began to build, and it continues to grow a bit. I'll flip through a few pictures here just to let you see what not a lot of people have ever seen before, but um, a lot of this is early Jugtown and art pottery from other places. Cole, uh, Oscar Batchelder, Edith Harwell, who made pots for the Mint Museum before moving to Alabama, J.H. Owen, earthenware of various sorts, some decorated, some undecorated. Most of this I can attribute through information to North Carolina makers. On the left would be mostly almond pottery, including the Maston decorated type pieces. And on the right would be from the Hilton potteries. The Hiltons moved around throughout the Western Piedmont area of the state and made wonderful pottery as well. And also some Cherokee and Catawba. Though the Catawba are South Carolina and right on the border of North Carolina, the connections are strong, and I like having those examples in the collection as well. People ask me how many pieces are in the collection. I don't know. I would guess I have collected over time anywhere from 7,000 to 8,000 examples, but probably maintain today somewhere in the 2,000 piece range. It's a horde, it's a lot, but I love it all. It's a lot of fun. So the collecting then led to research and writing. I pulled out my photography skills, which were meager, but enough to use in various ways for the research, and began to write what I was learning. I learned that one of the great resources for research was actually friends and collectors who taught me things like the late Everett James and Dr. Terry Zug, who's very, very influential, kind of the dean of North Carolina pottery, traditional pottery making. And I've learned great things from them. And also the stories and the information gleaned in research from potters like Vernon Owens, you see there, and Neola Cole in the middle, and Charlie Brown on the right. Stories like Neola, who died a few years ago now, was a wonderful person to visit and was always full of stories. And one day I was in the shop and I knew that she sold her pottery very inexpensively, and a lot of it was always moving out of the shop. And I said, Neola, how much pottery did you sell last year? And I was asking for a number of pieces just to get some sense of what she was doing, because most of it she and her grandson were making. And she thought a minute and she said, well, Steve, she says, last year we took in, and she gave me a dollar figure, and it was much larger than I expected. And then she just grinned and she said, and you know what? It's just dirt. And I thought then, I said, well, that's the best line I've heard in a long time. And if I ever get a chance to write a book and the publisher will allow me to use that in the title, I will. And the publisher did. And that's how that book got its name, was from Neola, acknowledging it's just dirt, but what you do with it does make a difference. And a wonderful person. I did enjoy visiting Neola a great deal. My first published writing about pottery was in 1996 for the North Carolina Folklore Journal. I found that Charlie Craven, who came from one of the old lines of pottery makers in the state, had in fact been one of the best potters early on in the early art pottery shops, and then gave it up altogether and didn't make pottery for decades. And then later in his life, he began again. And when you compare the pieces made early in his life and late in his life, they're as if he made them the same day. And so I began thinking, you know, he had this sense of form and shape that were the right way to him to make things. And he'd learned that. And I was able to write this article looking at that contrast and comparison of his early and late work. That then led to the book writing, and I count myself very, very fortunate that I've had publishers willing to let me have a hand at this and to write the things I've done. And as I mentioned, in addition to these books, one more is about to be released later this year that I'll mention again in just a moment. That led then to journal articles in places I never imagined I would be welcome to write, and again, feel very fortunate that have been able to do that. But sometimes the writing, the research and the writing led to strange places. For example, I found an indenture record in the state archives of North Carolina where it stated that Jacob Pugh took James Ward to learn the earthen potter's trade in Chatham County. And so immediately I'd never heard of Jacob Pugh, and I knew that that meant it was an early example of pottery making in the state, and began digging in. And I learned, interestingly, that Jacob Pugh was related to the James Pugh who had always been said to have been hanged after the Battle of Alamance in the Regulator movement before the Revolutionary War in North Carolina. But the problem was the James Pugh who supposedly was hanged was still living decades afterward. So there was something wrong with that story. Well, by digging into Potter Jacob Pugh's family and life, what I discovered was it wasn't James Pugh, but historians had mistakenly named him James when it was actually his brother Enoch Pugh, who was the father of Jacob Pugh. And Jacob Pugh, when his father died and was hanged, was just a young boy. And it looks like he probably learned to pot from someone in the Fox family in Chatham County. They were neighbors, and that seems most likely. But by pursuing a potter, Jacob Pugh ended up changing a bit of North Carolina history, which was a lot of fun, and the North Carolina Historical Review has allowed that story to be told. So that brings me to this point. I had written the books, I'd written the articles. I didn't need to do any more of that. I'm retired. I was happy not thinking about writing another book. And I really didn't want to write another book. And a good friend, Barry Huffman, who I am guessing is probably watching today, had been collecting Highland pottery, porcelain, made in Hickory, North Carolina. And she kept saying to me when she would see me, "You need to write this book." And she told me about some efforts earlier to put together a book. And she said, the story needs to be told. No one else is going to tell the story. You need to do this. And I said, Barry, I don't know anything about it. It's not the kind of pottery I collect. It's not anything that I think I would be interested in if I saw it. And she said, well, let me show it to you. So when she did, I said, well, that's not what I collect, but that's pretty nice. These are Highland porcelain examples attributed to Rookwood Pottery's Wilhelmine Ream, who became in 1947 a named designer for Highland porcelain. These bowls and the designs on them are attributed to Edgar Littlefield, who was an Ohio State University ceramics instructor and artist, decorated by a local woman, Louise Silly, in the 1947-49 period. Again, some Edgar Littlefield pieces decorated with some hand underglazed decoration on high-five porcelain. 1951, Charles Leslie Fordyce, the product designer, designed these two patterns that stepped apart from anything that Highland was making beforehand, which looked really old school until this in 1951, the golden bar and freeform lines. These elegant candlesticks in the Raymore Capri line made by Highland and designed by Michael Lax. And more examples of the Lax design for the Raymore Capri line. And this was 1953 in Hickory, being manufactured based on these designs by nationally known designers for a major mid-century company like Raymore. A beautiful bird bowl by Michael Lax's wife at the time, Rosemary. A line called Casual Craft, designed by Edwin Kayla in 1958. Again, made for Raymore by Highland, designed by someone well known at the time for modern design. Midas Gold and Silver, designed by Georges Briard, where a heavy raised layer of 22 karat gold was added onto pieces by a silk screen process developed probably in relation to Peerless Art Company in New York City with Esther Brody, who was doing this for Briard on drinking glasses, barware. Sculpted figures by Frances Johnson Moody, who was the wife of Les Moody, and together they were the founders of Highland Porcelain. And I see Herb, as I'm looking right now, Herb Cohen worked there in 1956 to 58, right out of school, and designed some garden club items, but also the portfolio collection, some of the examples that you see here from both of those collections designed by Herb, and a wonderful nesting bowl set in porcelain with Herb's design on the rims. So that book is about to come out, and I am not writing anymore if I can help it. I really got other things to do and want to do that, but it's been a great part of my collecting to be able to do that and to write and to make that happen. So finally, I want to tell you a tale of two turtles, because my collection is led in many directions, and this was one of the most unexpected for me. These two turtles are Moravian from the 1800-1820 period, attributed to Rudolph Christ, both made from the same mold, with an unusual design on the top of the shells that some believe may be related to Native American patterns, perhaps Cherokee. The green version on the left, with a bit of its spout missing, was sold some years back in Mebane at auction for $100,000. To my knowledge, that's the highest price paid for any traditional North Carolina pottery. It probably will be for quite some time to come. The one on the right is mine. I did not pay $100,000 for it. Nowhere near that. But it had issues like the green turtle, both of them missing portions of their head, but nice examples of something very important and very early in North Carolina pottery making. And I had this hunch. I thought, I keep hearing about digital scanning and 3D printing. And I wondered, would Salem and Mazda allow their very expensive turtle, which has most of its head, which we know is the same head mold that would have been used on my turtle's body, allow it to be scanned and 3D printed? And I thought, of course they will not. And they did. So Dr. Bernard Means from Virginia Commonwealth University was doing a great bit of this, it still is, doing wonderful work with scanning, came to Winston-Salem and scanned both turtles, built digital models for them, and from that was able to create a digital plan for a new head for my turtle. At first, plastic models were printed to make sure they would fit. He was able to close the gap in the green turtle's head so it no longer existed. You'll see the finished product there on the lower right-hand side. Then Lawrence Bradshaw and Jules Whelan in Asheville, whom I'd known for some years, agreed, they're professional museum conservators, and agreed to mount the new head, which actually is fired ceramic. It's not plastic. It was printed in ceramic material and fired in a kiln to reattach it and paint it. And there's the result. So good for another 200 years, perhaps, a lot longer than I'll be around. So with that, I will close. That's just a quick walkthrough of my journey as a collector, which has become a very important part of my life. It's introduced me to wonderful people, collectors, historians, and others that love this as much as I do. And it's really a wonderful opportunity to just share a bit of my story today, not being a potter, but being only a collector of others' work has been a joy. And I do wish to thank Dale Home Service League and the Mint and all who have made this possible and have welcomed me into this opportunity. And it means a great deal to me, and I'm very thankful for that. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Vince, and perhaps there are some questions you'd like to ask.
Thanks, Steve. That's fascinating. I think we'd all love to get up there and prowl around in your collection there, and
Yeah.
And most importantly, be able to hear your explanations of these pieces. You know,
Everyone has a story. Every
great.
piece has a story. Yeah.
So if you've got questions for Steve, please, you can either type them in the chat section or just go ahead and take yourself off mute and pose your question. We've got a couple of minutes if you've got anything that you'd like to ask. Did ask Steve about the availability of his books. You know, he's got quite a collection of offerings there. I know the store at the gift shop at the Mint has a number of his editions there. The North Carolina Pottery Center keeps a pretty good stock of his books available. And then Steve, you said they're generally available through Amazon or?
Yes, they are, or directly through the various publishers. Yes.
Good. Steve, what's the market for historic pottery these days? I had heard at one point that, you know, prices had gone up and then they've been sort of more depressed, but are there a lot of, you know, is there an active collector market for historic North Carolina pottery these days?
Yes, there is. Prices on much of the, particularly the art pottery, peaked in the early 2000s. And after the 2008 financial issues arose, it bottomed out. A lot of things that had gained considerably just lost value. And since then, what's happened, some of the mid-range examples, good condition, something about them a bit rare, come back and they're doing okay, maybe back up near the level they were then. The best of the best pieces, the rarest pieces are way above and are doing great. And so, you know, like with any collectible, the best pieces have certainly increased in value in recent years.
Good. We've got a question of what was the last piece you found, and are you still actively collecting?
Yes, I am. I try to be more discerning about my collecting because I've given out of room, for it anywhere else. Probably the most recent traditional piece was a Manly Luck salt glazed jug made in Eula, North Carolina. I'd only seen one before, and was able to purchase that. As far as Highland, I have been collecting some Highland. Usually when I'm writing about something, I collect it and photograph it, learn from it. And I did recently purchase an example of the freeform line. And you'll see behind me a couple of examples like this piece, the gold bar, a couple of those pieces recently. So yes, I'm still collecting, uh, but trying to back off a bit. Very hard for a collector to do.
So I'm not sure if everyone is, totally familiar with Highland. Can you tell us a little bit more about Highland as a company? Are they still producing today, or?
No, the original Highland Company began incorporated in 1945, made the first run of pottery late in 1946, and really began production in 47. But in 1973, the company was sold to a lamp manufacturer and became Highland Costco. And then that company was sold and became Highland Limited. And then that company was sold and became Vanguard Studios. So the original Highland Incorporated period was basically from in production 1947 to 1973. Les Moody had worked at Abingdon Pottery, Rookwood, San Jose Pottery. He was an OSU graduate with a BFA. And when he came there, was very ready to make this a big operation and knew what he was doing. He found investors in the Hickory area, and they raised $500,000 in stock to fund it. And today's money, that'd be over $7 million. And this was right in the after years of World War II, which is pretty amazing. But so they continued to make it. And usually they had an in-house designer like Herb was for a while, but they also used contract designers from outside. Very often, it seems he would find lamp-based designers that were brought in from other lamp-based companies, and he liked what they were doing, and then he would ask them to design artware. Mostly what they made was either for floral arrangement or smoking. It was a big time for smoking. So a lot of ashtrays and things of that sort. But as time went on, the designs changed, and some of it is not much to be proud of, I'm afraid. Some of it called nifty gifties, but some of it really did pull off. I think it's a pretty good design, and that's what made the company successful.
Well, I think the Delham owes Highland a big debt of gratitude because Herb, I believe the story is that the job at Highland is what brought you to North Carolina, and you came to work at Highland and have stayed in North Carolina ever since.
That's right.
Wonderful. And we've got a question in the chat whether you've created a database of all of your collection. Have you cataloged it all?
Oh, I was hoping no one would ask that. Yeah, because I did work with the North Carolina Pottery Center and did enter all of their collection into their database, but I've never done that myself. And that's one of the reasons I keep saying I don't need to write anymore. I need to take time and do that myself. Now, I do keep records. I have a record of all of the purchases I've made. I can go back and do that, but I've never put it into a database. But on the list of things to do.
Steve, do you have pictures of all those that you've owned over the years?
No, I do not. I've not photographed everything. I do have photographs of much of the collection because as I've written and used examples, I have those photographs. But again, that's something I would need to do as I built the database. So, yeah.
Good. Well, anyone else have any last questions to wrap us up? Well, I think we've got a lot of, oh, someone just asked if you ever do tours or.
Rarely. I have for individuals that I know and trust. It's not just so much about taking it, it's about breaking it. It's in a small space and lots of it. So we have to be careful about that. But in the past, I've hosted groups like the North Carolina Folk Art Society and other groups have come and seen what I have. Yes. So I do that. And I'm very open sharing what I have. I don't see it as something that's just for my enjoyment, but do very much like showing it to other people who are interested. The ones who come in and just get glazed over eyes and say, wow, that's a lot of stuff, but the ones that like you folks would be and say, what's the story on that piece? Or who made that? Or why did you go? I have a couple now that collectors look at and say, why did you want that piece? And I can tell them exactly why. But yeah, I do from time to time share the collection.
Well, we've already got a suggestion in the chat that we need to be organizing a Dell home visit sometime. So
be glad to talk about it. Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your history and explanation. That's been fascinating to see. So I know I've gotten a lot out of it. I think based on comments, everyone has enjoyed this very much. So we thank you for doing the program today.
Thank you. Thank you, Vince.
All right, I'm going to end the recording.